What I want to do in this video is to continue a discussion that was started last week when I released a video called MarketWatch. And in this video, what I attempted to do was to start a discussion and a dialogue about the overall health of the comic book market. Part of the reason why I did this is because I have been watching and participating in discussions where people are using anecdotal occurrences and information to support an argument that we are headed towards a comic bust, similar to what happened to comics back in the 90s. And so what I wanted to do was to spend a little bit of time looking at the dynamics associated with the current comic book market. And that's part of what I did in the previous video that was released last week. I want to continue that discussion with this new video, in which I am going to attempt to look at, again, the health of the overall comic market, and where possible, kind of contrast that to some dynamics that were taking place back in the 90s. Now, I am no expert when it comes to the dynamics of the comic book market, right? But what I have been able to do is to reach out to some folks that are much more knowledgeable than I, that have been involved in the distribution of comics and also involved in the monitoring of the overall health of the comic book market. And this is basically what they do. So I reached out to some folks to get some additional insight, to get some hard numbers and some metrics that I could bring forward for the purpose of this video. My hope is that as you watch this video, you will internalize some of the metrics, some of the data that I am bringing forward. And my hope is that you'll be able to draw your own conclusions from the data that I'm presenting. My goal, as always, is not necessarily to tell you what to think or how to behave or how to collect. But what I do want to do is to foster a discussion and foster a dialogue so that you can make some informed decisions. Instead of using anecdotal evidence as proof, let's look at some hard numbers. Reggie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to the MarketWatch. This video series was created to try to foster a dialogue regarding the overall health of the comic book market. My hope is that from time to time, I'll be able to bring forth some analytics and some data that you can use to make some informed decisions regarding how you are choosing to collect comics. In this video, I am going to dig into some metrics and some data surrounding what's happening currently in the comic book market. And where possible, I am going to contrast that to what happened back in the 90s when the comic book market went bust. So enjoy this video, listen to this video, and make some informed decisions for yourself. The first thing that I want to examine in this video is the number of customer accounts that were open back in 1993, and then we'll talk about what that looks like today. There were an estimated 11,000 customer accounts open at the end of 1993. Now, I'm not saying that there were 11,000 comic shops across the country, but I am saying that there were roughly 11,000 accounts whereby someone could purchase comics from one of the various distributors out there. These accounts could have been pop-up shops, trunk dealers, large collectors looking for discounts, and yes, even some actual brick and mortar comic shops. The true number of brick and mortar shops is actually estimated to be around 7,000 or so stores back in 1993. Many of you know that I had an opportunity to recently go through 400 long boxes of comics. Well, I should say attempt to go through 400 long boxes. But as I took a look at this collection, I was coming across sealed diamond boxes. And I couldn't really figure out why this particular collector had those boxes. I assumed that maybe he picked them up from the local comic shop. And it wasn't until I started doing the research for this video that I realized that maybe what he had done was to open an account with Diamond directly and actually purchase comics directly from Diamond, bypassing the comic shop altogether. So 11,000 or so customer accounts had been opened in 1993. And now I want to contrast that to the number of accounts present day. The number of accounts is estimated to be somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 accounts. On the low end, that is roughly 18% of the number of accounts that were seen in 1993. And as you just heard, that is a huge decrease to go from 11,000 to somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 accounts. That's just a massive decrease. And one of the questions that you may be asking yourself right now is, why did the number of accounts balloon in the 90s and then shrink so dramatically? If you're thinking that, it really is a good question. And by and large, it comes back to the money. In 1993, for instance, the market hit a pretty high mark at $850 million. 850 million. This number includes comics and trade paperbacks. And if you do the math backwards, this comes out to be a massive number of comics and trade paperbacks that were flooding into the market. To illustrate this point in more detail, let's look at a single month in 1993. In April of 1993, there were 48 million comics sold. 48 million in a single month. That being April of 1993. That is a massive number of books to be produced and sold in one single month. And that's part of the reason why, there was this high watermark of $850 million generated. So with that kind of money in the wind, what we saw was essentially a perfect storm. We saw publishers start to increase the number of titles that were released each month. There were new publishers, coming into the market and cranking out even more content. The distributors relaxed their new account criteria, which basically allow more accounts to be created and set up. And of course, these accounts were able to purchase more and more comics from the publishers. We saw auction houses setting records for comics being sold. We even saw the average person flocking into comic shops to buy up the hot comics and even the not so hot comics by the handful, because they assumed that they would get rich off of these books. And if we look at, for example, what happened with Jim Lee's X-Men, for example, this is the best-selling comic of all time. This book had 5 covers and sold a staggering 8.2 million copies. I want you to keep these numbers in mind, because we will contrast them to some numbers from 2018 very shortly. But again, what we saw happening in the 90s was a perfect storm. Just like the housing crisis of the 2000s, the cause of the comic bubble and the subsequent crash were multifactorial. If you think about it, there have been numerous documentaries and movies that have been made looking at the causes of the housing crash. Was there some corruption? Yes. Was there some mismanagement? Yes. How about ignorance? Absolutely. But you cannot point to a single thing or a single person as the cause for the crisis. The same goes for what happened with comics. There were a lot of factors at play that only through hindsight can you really begin to kind of connect the dots and see how the dominoes were lined up to fall in just the right order. But here's the good news. The good news is that the comic market has stabilized. And more importantly, it's not nearly what it was in the 90s. And maybe that's a good thing. If you look at the overall market for comics, if you look at the overall market, including graphic novels and comics, the market has been up 5 of the last 6 years and 11 of the last 14 years. Yes, there has been a 6-quarter recession from the fall of 2016 into the winter of 2018. But as I mentioned in my previous video, the market is firmly back into positive territory for the year as of October. We saw a small positive growth in September, and that growth continued into October. And the hope is that this positive trend line will continue for the remainder of the year. But we have to see what happens, of course, with November to see if that positive trend continues. But fingers crossed that it does indeed happen. Some of you may be thinking that the positive growth that we've begun to see in September and October is the result of comic companies producing more incentive variants, and of course, encouraging local comic shops to buy those incentive variants. So let's talk about that for a moment. The tiered incentives do encourage retail outlets to purchase additional books, which distorts the real demand and creates some softness in the market. There is zero doubt about that. But according to Chronicon, the publishers adjusted their tiering structures in 2017 to make it easier for local comic shops to actually hit these targets in 2018 and to actually participate in some of these incentive programs. If you have a chance, I'd ask you to ask your local comic shops if this is indeed the case. My assumption is that there's going to be a mixed bag of responses. Some will say yes, that it's easier. Some will say no. And I personally know that some comic shops don't even try to play that game at all. They just refuse to do it. But if you get a chance and can ask your local comic shop, let me know in the comments what their response is to that. So, as I get to the end of the data portion of this video, I want to shift gears just a little bit, and I want to revisit some of the print quantities that we discussed earlier. I mentioned that there were 48 million comics that were sold in the single month of April of 1993. And I'm curious what you think the current number might be. Any guesses at all as to what this number might be? When you add up the top 500 comics sold in October of 2018, they amount to less than 8 million copies, less than X-Men #1. So my hope is that as you think about these numbers that I rattled off and as I contrasted them to what was happening in the 90s, my hope is that you are gaining a little bit of clarity as to how the market is performing now versus how the market was performing then. Maybe there's some similarities between the two times. But the question is, are there more differences than there are similarities? And if there are similarities, how meaningful are those similarities? As I mentioned at the top of this video, My goal is to continue adding to this dialogue, to continue to bring forth some numbers, some data for you to make some informed decisions for yourself. As I did the research for this video, as I spoke to people that are involved in the comic industry that have been involved since the 90s, they are telling me that it is a night and day difference between then and now. Yes, there's some softness. Yes, there's some similarities, but they are saying it is a night and day difference between the two. But at the end of the day, you are going to have to make up your mind on whether you believe that we are headed towards the crash or whether we're not. And regardless of where you stand, I think that maybe there are some things that you might choose to do different based upon your understanding of the data and based upon your true beliefs. I will continue to bring forth some data which I hope will improve all of our understanding of what's happening with comics. And as I mentioned, I am no expert at this thing. Back in the 90s, I was headed off to college. I was a teenager. I wasn't intimately involved with any of this stuff. And so I've tried to get myself up to speed to better understand the differences and the similarities, and to also try to make up my own mind. What's happening? Are these things that I'm seeing true, or are they not true? And also just to allow me to make better decisions about my own collection. So I'm doing this partly for myself, but I'm also doing it partly for you guys as well. As you watch this video, if you have thoughts, if you have suggestions, if there's things that you want me to look at, by all means, enter those comments into the fields below, and let's have the conversation. Let's have a dialogue, and let's see where this MarketWatch series takes us. As always, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Take care.